7 years. That is how long Eleanor Whitfield had been driving past the same intersection on her way to work every single morning without stopping. 7 years of red lights. 7 years of glancing at the people who stood at the edges of that intersection holding cardboard signs, looking away the way most people learn to look away, not from cruelty but from a particular kind of grief that makes looking too dangerous. 7 years since her daughter Maya disappeared from a school parking lot on a Tuesday afternoon in October, and was never found. Not a body. Not a confirmed ending. Not the kind of closure that lets a person grieve cleanly and move forward. Just an absence that never resolved itself. A case that went cold after 18 months. A police file that still technically remained open but that nobody actively worked anymore. Eleanor Whitfield was the CEO of a logistics company worth approximately $400 million. She had built it from a single warehouse. Her father left her into a company with operations across 11 states. She was, by every external measure, one of the most successful women in her industry. And every single morning for 7 years, she had been quietly, privately, completely destroyed by a wound that never closed. On a Thursday morning in March, her driver stopped at the same red light he had stopped at hundreds of times before. Eleanor was looking at her phone, reviewing a quarterly report, the way she looked at her phone at every red light because looking at anything else had become unbearable years ago. And then something made her look up. She does not remember exactly what it was. A flash of light. A particular angle of movement. The specific muscle memory of a mother's eye that catches certain things even when the conscious mind has stopped actively searching. On the wrist of a small girl standing at the edge of the intersection, holding a paper cup, wearing clothes that were too thin for the March morning, was a watch. A small child-sized watch with a pale blue band and a tiny silver clasp shaped like a butterfly. The exact watch Eleanor had given her daughter Maya for her 8th birthday. The watch Maya had been wearing the day she disappeared. The watch that police had searched for 18 months and never recovered. On the wrist of a girl Eleanor Whitfield had never seen before in her life. Eleanor's hand was on the car door handle before she had finished processing what she was looking at. Her driver said something. She did not hear it. She was already outside in the March cold, walking toward a child who was looking at her now with the specific wariness of someone who has learned that adults approaching quickly rarely means anything good. Eleanor knelt down in front of her, right there at the edge of the intersection, traffic continuing to move around them, and she pointed at the watch and she said, in a voice that did not sound entirely like her own, "Where did you get that?" And the girl looked at her. And then she said one sentence. 6 words. 6 words that would take Eleanor Whitfield exactly 40 minutes to fully understand, and that would change the course of the next several months of her life completely. My name is Eleanor Whitfield. This is the story of what those 6 words actually meant, and what I found at the end of them. Stay with me, because this story does not end the way you think it does in the first 10 minutes. It is going to take you somewhere you don't expect, and it is going to take its time getting there because some things deserve to be told slowly. Subscribe right now because this is exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell. New story every single day. Hit that button before we go any further. I need to tell you about who I was before October 7th, because the woman who knelt down at that intersection 7 years later was not entirely the same person who existed before that date. I built Whitfield Logistics from a single warehouse my father left me when he died. I was 26 years old. I had an MBA and a stubborn streak and absolutely no idea how much work was actually involved in running a logistics company, which in retrospect was probably an advantage, because I did not yet know enough to be afraid of it. My father had built the original business with 4 trucks and a handshake reputation across 3 counties. He was not a man given to expansion. He liked knowing every driver by name. He liked the smallness of it, the controllability of it. When he died of a heart attack at his desk at 61 years old on a Wednesday with an invoice half finished in his typewriter, he left me a company that was, by any modern standard, dangerously small and dangerously behind on technology and dangerously dependent on the personal relationships he alone had cultivated for 30 years. I spent the first 5 years simply trying not to lose what he had built. I spent the next 10 years building it into something he would not have recognized. By the time Maya was 7 years old, we operated in 9 states. By the time she disappeared, we were a name that competitors in our industry had started watching carefully. I tell you all of this not because the business itself matters to this story, but because I need you to understand the texture of the years that shaped how I responded 3 weeks ago to a watch on a stranger's wrist. I had spent 25 years learning to trace problems backward through complicated systems, to take a single broken link in a supply chain and follow it patiently, methodically, through every node and connection until I understood exactly where and how things had gone wrong. This is not a metaphor I am applying retroactively to make the story feel neater. It is genuinely how my mind works. It is the specific cognitive architecture that 25 years of running a logistics company had built into me. Maya was born when I was 37. My husband David and I had tried for almost 6 years before she arrived, and I want to be honest with you about something I have spent considerable time processing with a therapist over the past 7 years, because honesty matters more to me now than the comfortable version of any story. I worked too much when Maya was small. I missed things. Recitals. A handful of parent-teacher conferences that David attended alone, while I was in a different state opening a new regional facility. Bedtimes that became increasingly rare as the company grew and the demands on my time multiplied in ways that felt, at the time, completely unavoidable and now feel, in retrospect, like choices I made without fully recognizing them as choices. I am not telling you this to punish myself in front of you 7 years later, in a story I am narrating to strangers. I am telling you because it is true, and because the version of this story that paints me as a perfect mother whose daughter was simply, randomly taken by cruel and indifferent fate is not the complete version. It is not the honest version. And I have decided, in the years since October 7th, that honesty is the only currency I have left that feels worth protecting. I loved Maya with everything I had. But everything I had was being divided every single day between a company that needed me and a daughter who needed me, and I did not always choose well. I do not think any parent building something demanding while raising a child chooses perfectly every time. I think the difference, in my case, is that the consequences of my imperfect choices became permanently, unbearably visible in a way that most parents are spared. What I want you to understand is this: by the time Maya was 8, I had started to change that. I had started saying no to board meetings that conflicted with her events. I had hired a chief operating officer specifically so I could step back from day-to-day operations and be present for her childhood in the way I had not been present enough for her early years. I remember the specific conversation with my COO, a man named Harold Vance who had been with the company for 11 years by then, where I told him I needed to restructure my role. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "Eleanor, you built this entire company around being indispensable to it. Are you sure you're ready to be dispensable for a little while?" I told him I was sure. I was not entirely sure, but I was trying. The watch was part of that effort. That changing chapter of my life as a mother. I bought it for Maya's 8th birthday in September, the year she disappeared. It was not an expensive watch. It cost $43. I remember the exact amount because I remember standing in the store thinking that I, a woman who ran a $400 million company, was spending an unusual amount of mental energy deciding between a watch with a butterfly clasp and one with a small enamel flower. I chose the butterfly because Maya had been obsessed with butterflies that summer. She had a butterfly garden book she had checked out from the library so many times the librarian eventually told her gently that she might as well just keep it, because nobody else seemed to want it as badly as she did. She had asked me, more than once, lying on her stomach on the living room floor with that book open in front of her, whether butterflies remember being caterpillars, whether some part of them held on to what they used to be even after they transformed into something completely different. I did not have a good answer for her at the time. I told her I did not know, but that it seemed like a question worth thinking about. She seemed satisfied with that answer in the way that 8-year-olds are often satisfied with adults simply taking their questions seriously rather than dismissing them. I have thought about that question more times than I can count in the 7 years since. She wore that watch every single day after her birthday. She wore it the day she disappeared. I am not going to spend a great deal of time on the day Maya disappeared, because I have spent 7 years circling that day in my mind in ways that have not produced anything except pain, and because the day itself is not really what this story is about. But I need to give you enough of it to understand everything that follows. Maya was 8 years old. She attended Brookfield Elementary, a school I had chosen specifically because it was close to home and had a reputation for small class sizes and attentive teachers, the kind of place that felt, when David and I toured it years earlier, like somewhere a child could be genuinely known rather than simply processed through a system. On October 7th, a Tuesday, her after-school program ended at 4:15. The program existed precisely because of my work schedule, because someone needed to bridge the gap between school ending and a parent's availability, and on most days that bridge was filled by either David or, less often than I would have liked, by me. That particular Tuesday, David was supposed to pick her up. He called me around 3:45, mildly frustrated, stuck in traffic on the interstate after a meeting that had run long. He estimated he would be about 15 minutes late. 15 minutes is nothing. I want you to understand that. 15 minutes is the kind of delay that happens to every parent regularly, without consequence, thousands of times across thousands of ordinary days. In those 15 minutes, somewhere in the gap between the program ending and David's arrival, Maya disappeared from the school parking lot. There was a security camera at the school, positioned to monitor the main entrance rather than the side lot where the after-school pickup occurred. It captured a partial, distant image of a vehicle leaving the area around the relevant time, but the footage was not clear enough to identify make, model, or license plate with any certainty. The angle was wrong. The distance was too great. The resolution, in a school district operating on a limited technology budget, was simply not adequate to the task that footage would eventually be asked to perform. There were no witnesses who saw anything definitive. The after-school program coordinator, a young woman named Jessica who had worked there for less than a year, remembered Maya leaving the building at the normal time to wait outside, as the children were instructed to do, in the designated pickup area. She did not see what happened after that, because her attention had been pulled by another child inside who needed help finding a dropped inhaler. 90 seconds, perhaps 2 minutes of unsupervised time in a parking lot on an ordinary Tuesday was apparently enough. There was an extensive search. There was a police investigation that consumed 18 months of active resources, involving detectives, search dogs, volunteer searches that drew hundreds of people from the surrounding community in the first frantic weeks, media coverage that lasted considerably longer than most cases of this type typically receive, in part because of who I was and the resources I was able to bring to bear on keeping the case visible. I personally funded an additional private investigation alongside the police work, spending an amount of money I will not specify here because the number itself is not the point, and because I would have spent 10 times that amount or 100 times without a second's hesitation, if I had believed it would have brought her home even one day sooner. There was no resolution. Maya Whitfield was never found. Not a body. Not a confirmed location. Not a single piece of evidence that told us definitively what had happened to her. The case went cold officially after 18 months, though I want to be precise about what that phrase actually means in practice. It does not mean the case was closed. It means the active, dedicated resources that had been assigned to it were gradually redirected to other, more solvable cases, the way limited resources in any system, including a police department, inevitably get redirected toward problems that show signs of being solvable. For 7 years I lived inside that absence. My husband, David, and I separated 18 months after Maya disappeared. I want to talk about this honestly because I think the story of what grief does to a marriage matters, even though it is not the central thread of what I am telling you today. We did not separate because we stopped loving each other, or because either of us did anything that constituted a betrayal in the conventional sense. We separated because grief without resolution has a way of either binding two people together so tightly they cannot function separately, or pulling them so far apart that proximity becomes unbearable, because every shared space becomes saturated with a presence that is also, unbearably, an absence. We became the second kind. David could not be in our house without seeing Maya everywhere. The yellow walls of her bedroom, which we had painted together the summer before she turned 6, became something he could not pass in the hallway without his entire body changing, visibly, in a way I learned to recognize and could not fix. I, conversely, found a strange and admittedly unhealthy comfort in staying inside that saturation. I did not repaint her room. I did not move her things. I would sit on the floor of her bedroom some evenings, after particularly difficult days, simply existing inside the specific quality of silence that room contained. We tried counseling together for almost a year before we both, separately and then together, acknowledged that we needed different things from our grief, and that staying married while needing fundamentally different things was its own kind of slow harm. We are friendly now. I want you to know that because it matters to how the later parts of this story unfold. David remarried 4 years ago, to a woman named Patricia who has been, by every account I have received, kind to him in ways that this period of his life required. They have a son now, 2 years old, and I have met him exactly twice, at moments that were carefully, gently arranged by David with a sensitivity toward what those meetings might mean for me that I have never stopped being grateful for. I kept working. I want to tell you that honestly because I think people expect a story like this one to involve a complete collapse, an abandonment of everything else in life in service of grief. That is not always how grief works for everyone. For me, the company became the structure that held me upright. The meetings, the quarterly reports, the operational decisions, all of it gave me a shape to occupy when the alternative was simply dissolving into the absence Maya had left behind. I am not certain this was the healthiest way to grieve. My therapist, a careful and patient woman named Dr. Sandra Liu, who I have seen weekly for 6 of the past 7 years, has gently suggested, more than once, that the company became less a source of stability for me and more a place to hide from feelings that needed to be felt directly rather than processed through quarterly earnings calls. She is probably right. I have made peace with the fact that surviving something like this rarely looks like the wisdom literature on grief suggests it should look. I survived in the way that was available to me, which involved considerable amounts of work, considerable amounts of avoidance, and a level of professional success that, from the outside, looked entirely disconnected from the private devastation underneath it. I drove the same route to work every single day, past the same intersection, past the same people standing at its edges with their cardboard signs, and their particular kinds of invisible exhaustion. I never stopped, not once in 7 years, because stopping required a kind of presence I had not had access to since October 7th. I drove past, I looked away, and I went to work, and I came home, and I did it again the next day. Until the Thursday morning in March. I have relived the moment of seeing that watch more times than I can count in the weeks since, and I want to try to describe it as precisely as I can, because the precision matters. I was looking at my phone. A quarterly report from our western region that needed my attention before a 9 o'clock call. A relatively unremarkable Thursday morning in March, the kind of morning that contained no warning, no premonition, nothing that distinguished it from the approximately 1800 mornings that had preceded it since Maya disappeared. The car was stopped at the red light, the same red light, the engine idling, my driver Marcus waiting with the particular patience of someone who has driven the same route with the same passenger for years, and has learned not to make conversation during the morning commute, having understood, somewhere in our early months working together, that I preferred the silence to fill itself with the work on my phone rather than with any attempt at small talk. Something made me look up. I genuinely do not know what it was. I have thought about this extensively, turning it over in the weeks since like a stone I keep returning to, and the most honest answer I can give you is that some part of a mother's perception does not fully turn off, even after 7 years, even after the conscious mind has built elaborate structures of avoidance and distraction designed specifically to make daily functioning possible. Some part of me was still scanning, still looking, even when I believed I had stopped looking, even when I had spent 7 years training myself specifically not to look too closely at the people I passed at that intersection because looking too closely had become unbearable years earlier. There was a girl standing near the corner. 8 or 9 years old, I would guess, though grief and shock are not reliable instruments for estimating a stranger's age in real time. She was holding a paper cup, the way children at that intersection sometimes held cups for their parents, a detail that registered somewhere in my peripheral awareness without yet rising to conscious significance. Her clothes were thin for the temperature, a light jacket that was clearly not warm enough for a March morning that still carried winter's edge in the wind. And on her wrist, exposed where her jacket sleeve had ridden up slightly as she shifted the cup between her hands, was a watch. A small watch. A pale blue band. A clasp shaped like a butterfly. I want to be very precise about what happened in my body in that moment, because I think it matters enormously for understanding everything that came after. I did not think consciously in any articulated sentence that this could be Maya. I want to be honest about that distinction because I think it matters. 7 years is a long time. An 8 or 9-year-old girl at this intersection would be the wrong age if this had somehow impossibly been my own daughter, who would now be 15, a fact my mind was perfectly capable of calculating even in the disoriented half-second of recognition. What I thought, in the space before thought became action, was simpler and more specific than that, and harder to fully articulate even now. That watch. Not a watch like that one. Not a similar watch. That specific watch, the one I had selected in a store 6.5 years earlier between a butterfly clasp and an enamel flower, the one I had clipped onto my daughter's wrist on her 8th birthday while she stood in front of the bathroom mirror admiring it with an expression of pure, uncomplicated joy that I can still see with perfect clarity, The one that had been on her wrist in the last photograph I had of her, taken that same morning before school. The one that had never been recovered. Despite an exhaustive search that covered every detail of what she had been wearing, down to the specific brand of her sneakers. I was out of the car before I had finished forming a complete thought. I do not know what I looked like to that little girl in the moment I crossed the sidewalk toward her. I have thought about this since because I think it matters, because a strange adult moving quickly toward a child who is alone and vulnerable is not a neutral event from the child's perspective, regardless of the desperation driving that adult's actions. I tried even in that state to slow myself down, to make my approach less alarming. I do not know how successful I was. Marcus, my driver, had called something after me as I left the car, and I would later learn he had followed me out, hovering a respectful distance away, ready to intervene if the situation required it, though I have no memory of his presence in that moment at all. I knelt down in front of her at her eye level, the way I had been trained years earlier in some long-forgotten parenting class to approach children when you need their trust quickly, a piece of advice I had filed away and never expected to need in circumstances anything like this one. She looked at me with an expression I will describe as careful. Not frightened exactly, but assessing. The expression of a child who has learned, through whatever circumstances had brought her to that intersection holding a paper cup, that adults require careful evaluation before any trust is extended. I pointed at her wrist. My hand was not entirely steady. "Where did you get that?" I asked. "The watch. Where did you get it?" She looked down at her wrist, as if confirming for herself what I was asking about. Then she looked back up at me. And she said 6 words. She said, "My mom said it was mine." 6 words that I would spend the next several hours and then days and then weeks trying to fully understand. My mom said it was mine. Not "I found it." Not "someone gave it to me." My mom said it was mine. The phrasing implied something I needed to understand immediately, with an urgency that overrode every professional instinct I had ever developed in 25 years of careful business decision-making. Every instinct that should have told me to slow down, to think clearly, to approach this with the methodical patience that had served me so well in every other domain of my life. "What's your name?" I asked her. "Sophie," she said. "Sophie, can you tell me about your mom? Is she here?" Sophie looked past me, toward a woman sitting on a folding chair near a shopping cart filled with belongings, perhaps 30 feet away, watching our interaction with an expression I could not read at that distance. An expression that I would later understand, once I knew her better, was a very specific blend of protective alertness and the particular fatigue of someone who has spent years anticipating threats that most people never have to think about. "That's my mom," Sophie said. I stood up. My legs were not entirely steady either. I looked toward the woman and she was already standing, already moving toward us with the particular protective speed of a parent who has noticed a stranger talking to her child. A speed I recognized instantly and completely, because it was a speed I had once possessed myself, before circumstances took away my opportunity to ever need it again. I want to tell you what I expected in that moment because I think the expectation matters for understanding what actually happened. I expected, somewhere in the panicked architecture of my thoughts, that I was about to discover something terrible. That this woman had somehow acquired my daughter's watch through means that would require immediate police involvement. That this encounter was the first thread of unraveling something dark and criminal that connected directly to Maya's disappearance. Perhaps even that this woman herself might somehow be connected to whatever had happened 7 years earlier. I was wrong. But the way I was wrong was more complicated, and in some ways more devastating, than anything I had imagined in that frozen half-second at the edge of a city intersection. The woman's name was Renee Calloway. She was 34 years old, though grief and hardship can age a person's face in ways that make estimating exact age difficult, and I would not have guessed her age correctly if she had not told me directly later in our conversation. She reached us within seconds, placing herself slightly between Sophie and me, a protective positioning that I understood completely and respected immediately, having occupied that exact position myself countless times in the years before October 7th. "Can I help you with something?" she asked, and her voice carried a wariness that I recognized, because I had spent 7 years cultivating a similar wariness toward strangers who approached too quickly with too much intensity, toward anyone whose interest in my daughter felt slightly too sharp, slightly too sudden. "I'm sorry," I said, and I genuinely was sorry for how I must have appeared to her. A well-dressed stranger kneeling in front of her daughter at a traffic intersection on an ordinary Thursday morning. I don't mean any harm. I just need to ask about the watch your daughter is wearing. Renee's expression shifted, something protective hardening further, her posture straightening in a way that communicated, without words, that this conversation was about to end very quickly if I did not provide an adequate explanation. It's hers, she said. I gave it to her. I know, I said. I'm not trying to take it from her. I just need to understand where it came from. It's important. I promise you, I'm not trying to cause any trouble for you or Sophie. Renee looked at me for a long moment, and I watched her conducting her own version of the rapid assessment Sophie had performed a moment earlier, reading my clothes, my car idling at the curb with Marcus standing nearby, my evident distress, weighing all of it against whatever threat calculus years of vulnerability had taught her to apply to unexpected strangers. Why does it matter to you? She asked. I told her the truth because I could not think of a version of this conversation that worked without it, because I had already decided, somewhere in the seconds it took me to cross that sidewalk, that whatever this conversation cost me in dignity or composure was a price I was willing to pay. That watch belonged to my daughter, I said. She disappeared 7 years ago. That watch was on her wrist when she disappeared. It was never found. Renee's face went through several transformations in the span of about 3 seconds. Shock first, her eyes widening, her hand moving slightly towards Sophie as if to gather her closer. Then something that looked like genuine fear, the specific fear of someone who suddenly understands they might be implicated in something they had no knowledge of, someone who has learned perhaps through hard experience, that systems designed to investigate crimes do not always extend the benefit of the doubt to people in her circumstances. Then, finally, something that looked like profound, searching confusion. I bought that watch, she said slowly, at a flea market. 18 months ago. Maybe a little less. Where? I asked. There's a flea market off Route 9 near the old fairgrounds. Every other Saturday. I go sometimes when I have a little money looking for things for Sophie. Do you remember who sold it to you? Renee thought for a moment, her eyes moving slightly as she searched her memory. A woman. Older. I don't remember her name. She had a table of kids' clothes, some jewelry, some little toys. I remember the watch because Sophie loved it immediately. The butterfly. She's always loved butterflies. I felt something cold move through my chest at that detail. The same detail Maya had loved. The same small specific obsession, transferred somehow, impossibly, onto a different child entirely, through whatever invisible chain had carried that watch from my daughter's wrist to a second-hand table to this child's wrist now. Can you find that woman again? Is there any way to find her? Renee looked at me carefully, and I could see her weighing the request, trying to understand what kind of person was asking, what kind of consequences might follow from her involvement. Why does this matter so much? She asked. If your daughter disappeared, the watch being found doesn't bring her back. I don't understand what you're trying to find. It was a fair question. It was, in fact, the question I needed to sit with myself, because in the rush of the morning's events, I had not yet fully articulated to myself what I was actually hoping to find. I need to know how that watch got from my daughter's wrist to a flea market table 18 months ago, I said. Because that's a trail. It's the first trail I've had in 7 years. And I need to follow it even if it doesn't lead anywhere good. I need to know. We did not have that entire conversation standing at the edge of the intersection. I asked Renee if she would be willing to sit with me for a few minutes, at a coffee shop a block away, where we could talk somewhere warmer and somewhere Sophie could have something to eat. I want to be transparent that I offered this not as a transaction but because the cold morning air had been biting at all three of us for the better part of 20 minutes, and because some part of me, even in my distracted state, recognized that this woman had been standing outside since early morning and likely had not eaten yet. We sat in a booth near the window. Sophie ordered hot chocolate and a pastry with the careful, slightly disbelieving gratitude of a child who has learned not to expect such things to be offered easily. Renee told me her story while Sophie focused on her pastry, and I want to share parts of it because it matters to understanding everything that followed, and because Renee's story deserves to be told with the dignity it was never given by the circumstances that produced it. She had worked until about 2 years earlier as an administrative coordinator for a mid-sized medical practice, a job she had held for nearly 6 years and had genuinely valued. She developed a serious illness during that time, one that required extended treatment and multiple hospitalizations. Her employer, operating within the letter of the law but not, in my assessment, within any reasonable standard of compassion, terminated her position once her medical leave exceeded what was legally protected. The medical debt that accumulated during her treatment, combined with the loss of income, made it impossible to maintain her apartment. Sophie's father had not been part of their lives in any meaningful way for several years before this, and Renee had been managing as a single parent throughout her illness and its aftermath. They had been without stable housing for almost 14 months by the time I encountered them at that intersection. Renee described with a careful, almost clinical precision that I recognized as a survival mechanism rather than emotional distance, the specific logistics of that existence. The shelters that had space some nights and not others. The library branches that served as daytime refuge during the coldest months. The particular exhaustion of trying to maintain enough stability for Sophie to attend school consistently while lacking the most basic infrastructure most people take entirely for granted. I know what it's like to lose someone, she told me, near the end of our conversation, in a moment that I did not press her to explain further at the time but that I have thought about often since. Not the same way you lost your daughter. But I know what it's like to not know where someone is, where you're going to be sleeping, what's going to happen next. I'll help you if I can. I would learn much later what she meant by that comment, in ways that added a dimension to this story I did not anticipate at the time. I want to pause the chronology here because I think what happened next requires some explanation about who I am, and how I make decisions, because what I did next was not impulsive in the way it might appear from the outside. I am a logistics CEO. My entire professional life has been built around tracing complicated chains of movement, tracking objects and shipments through complex networks, identifying where things go wrong in systems, and methodically working backward from an endpoint to understand a beginning. This is not a metaphor I am applying retroactively to make the story feel neater. It is genuinely how my mind works. A watch on a flea market table 18 months ago was, in the framework I understood best, simply a node in a supply chain. Something had moved that watch from point A, my daughter's wrist, on October 7 years ago, to point B, a flea market table 18 months ago. There was a chain of custody somewhere in between, however broken, however many hands the watch had passed through in the intervening years. I did not know if that chain would lead to anything about Maya herself. I understood, with the clear-eyed pragmatism that running a company for 25 years had given me, that the watch leaving Maya's possession on October 7th did not necessarily mean Maya herself was connected to wherever the watch had traveled afterward. A watch can be lost, discarded, stolen and resold multiple times through channels that have nothing to do with the original circumstances of its loss. But it was a thread. The first actual physical thread connected to that day that I had encountered in 7 years of nothing. I am not someone who leaves threads unfollowed. I gave Renee my card before we left the coffee shop. I asked her, with as much gentleness as I could manage in a situation that did not feel gentle to anyone involved, if she would be willing to help me find the woman who had sold her the watch, and I told her honestly that I intended to compensate her for her time and assistance regardless of where the investigation led. I want to tell you something about what happened next that surprised me, because I think it says something important about Renee that the rest of this story needs you to understand. Renee could have simply walked away. She owed me nothing. Her daughter's watch, however it had arrived in her possession, was legitimately hers now by any reasonable measure. She had purchased it in good faith from a seller at a flea market. There was no obligation on her part to involve herself in my search, particularly given the precarity of her own circumstances and the energy required simply to manage daily survival. She looked at Sophie, who was watching our conversation with the particular alertness children develop when adults are discussing something important that involves them indirectly. Then she looked at me. "I'll help you if I can," she said again, and this time her voice carried something more settled in it, a decision made rather than a possibility being considered. "Just promise me one thing. Whatever you find, you tell me too. I deserve to know what I've actually been giving my daughter." I promised her that. It was a promise I intended to keep, and one that, as this story unfolded, became considerably more complicated to fulfill than either of us anticipated in that coffee shop booth. I hired a private investigator that same afternoon, not because I distrusted Renee's account, but because I understood that finding a single unnamed seller at an occasional flea market required resources and methods I did not personally possess, and required them with a level of patience and professional rigor that my own emotional investment in the outcome would likely compromise. His name was Daniel Reyes. He had worked with my legal team years earlier on the original search for Maya, brought in during the 8th month of that initial investigation when the police case had begun to slow, and David and I, in our desperation, had sought additional resources wherever we could find them. Daniel had not found Maya during that original engagement, but he had been thorough, methodical, and honest with us in ways that I had come to value enormously during a period when honesty from professionals was not always guaranteed. I called him from my car, still parked near the intersection, Sophie's hot chocolate already finished, Renee and Sophie having returned to wherever they had been heading before our paths intersected so improbably that morning. "Eleanor," he said, recognizing my number immediately despite the years since we had last spoken. "Is everything all right?" I told him everything. The watch. Renee. Sophie. The flea market off Route 9. My voice, I am told by Marcus, who overheard portions of the call, was not entirely steady throughout. Daniel was quiet for a long moment after I finished. "I need you to understand something before we go further," he said carefully. "A watch like this, after 7 years moving through second-hand channels, this could lead absolutely nowhere connected to Maya. It could have been stolen from your house, lost somewhere unrelated to her disappearance, passed through a dozen hands that have nothing to do with what happened to her. I need you to be prepared for that possibility before we start, because I've seen hope like this lead people to devastating disappointment before, and I don't want that for you." "I understand," I said. "I need to follow it anyway." "I know," he said. "I'll start tomorrow. I want to be honest about the timeline here, because I think the reality of investigations like this matters more than the compressed version that makes for a satisfying story, and because the weeks that followed taught me something about patience that 25 years of business had never fully required of me." Daniel began with the flea market itself. It operated, as Renee had described, every other Saturday, organized informally by a property owner who rented table space to a rotating set of vendors. There were no formal records of who had occupied which table on any given date, but Daniel began the patient work of identifying regular vendors and asking careful questions, attending the market personally rather than relying solely on phone calls and second-hand inquiries. This took time. It took almost 3 weeks of careful work, attending the flea market personally on 2 separate Saturdays, talking to vendors, showing a photograph of the watch that Renee had provided, before he identified a woman who matched the description Renee had provided. I want you to understand what those 3 weeks felt like from inside my own daily life because I think it matters. I had spent 7 years learning with considerable difficulty how to manage hope, how to ration it carefully because unmanaged hope, in the context of an unresolved disappearance, has a way of metastasizing into something that consumes a person entirely, leaving nothing left for the ordinary functioning that life still requires. Those 3 weeks tested every piece of that careful management. I found myself more than once sitting in board meetings I had attended hundreds of times before, completely unable to follow conversations I would normally have led with confidence, my mind circling back again and again to a phone that might ring at any moment with news that could change everything or amount to nothing at all. Dr. Liu, my therapist, helped me through those weeks in ways I am genuinely grateful for. She did not tell me to manage my expectations, which I think would have been useless advice given the circumstances. Instead, she helped me build a structure for holding 2 truths simultaneously. That this thread might lead nowhere, and that following it anyway was the right and necessary thing to do regardless of the outcome. "You are not chasing false hope," she told me, in a session during the 2nd week of waiting. "You are honoring a thread that deserves to be followed. Those are different things, even when they feel identical from the inside." I held on to that distinction throughout those 3 weeks, even when holding on to it required more discipline than almost anything else I had done in 7 years. Daniel found her eventually, and he asked her carefully where she had acquired the watch she had sold 18 months earlier. Her name was Patricia Holloway. She was 61 years old. She sold second-hand children's items at flea markets and consignment events as a small supplementary income, alongside her primary work cleaning houses, a combination of income sources that Daniel told me was common among the vendors he had spoken with at that particular market. What she told him changed the entire direction of this investigation. I met Patricia Holloway myself, 2 days after Daniel's initial conversation with her, because I needed to hear what she had to say directly in my own presence, with my own questions available to ask, even though Daniel had assured me his initial conversation had been thorough. She was a careful woman, slightly nervous in my presence, though I tried to make clear from the outset, as I had with Renee, that I had no interest in causing her any trouble. She had done nothing wrong by selling items she had legitimately acquired through what appeared to be entirely legal means. What she told me was this. She had cleaned houses for a woman named Carol Brennan for almost 9 years. Carol Brennan lived alone in a modest house about 40 minutes from where Maya had disappeared. Patricia cleaned for her every other week, a routine that had become, over almost a decade, comfortable and familiar, the kind of long professional relationship that develops its own particular intimacy even within clearly maintained boundaries. Approximately 18 months before our conversation, Carol Brennan had died, apparently of natural causes related to a heart condition she had been managing for several years. She had no immediate family that Patricia was aware of, no spouse, no children that anyone had ever mentioned during 9 years of bi-weekly cleaning visits. A distant relative, a nephew Patricia had met only once at the modest memorial service that had been arranged, had handled the estate. He had asked Patricia, given her long history with the house and her knowledge of its contents, to help clear out personal items before the house was sold. He had no interest in most of what remained, living several states away with no intention of relocating, and had told Patricia she could take or sell whatever she found useful, as a small thank you for her years of service to his aunt. He didn't even really know her, Patricia told me, with a note of something like sadness in her voice. He said he'd visited maybe 3 times in his whole life, said she kept to herself mostly. I think he felt a little guilty about that, honestly, even though he didn't say it directly. Among the items Patricia had found in a box at the back of a closet were several pieces of children's clothing and a small collection of children's jewelry and accessories, including the watch. I always thought it was strange, Patricia told me. Carol never had kids. Never mentioned any. I asked her once years ago if she had grandchildren, because there was a kid's bicycle in her garage that I'd noticed when I was cleaning out there one summer. She got very quiet and just said no and changed the subject pretty quickly. I never asked again. Some things people don't want to talk about, and you learn to respect that when you're in someone's house regularly. You see things. You don't always ask. I felt something settle in my chest, cold and very still, listening to this detail. Did Carol Brennan ever mention where she got those items? A bicycle? Children's clothing? Patricia shook her head. Never. I just assumed maybe a niece or nephew had stayed with her once, years back, and left things behind. People don't always explain everything to the person who cleans their house. That's not really my business normally. Do you know anything else about Carol Brennan? Where she worked? Her history? Patricia thought for a moment. She used to work at a daycare, I think. A long time ago. Before she retired. She mentioned it sometimes, little stories about kids she used to look after. She seemed to genuinely love that work from how she talked about it. Said she missed it sometimes, even years after she stopped. Do you know which daycare? Patricia did not know the specific name, but she remembered vaguely that it had been somewhere near the eastern side of the city, and that Carol had stopped working there, according to her own recollection of things Carol had mentioned over the years, sometime around 7 years ago. I sat very still for a long moment, doing the arithmetic that Patricia had no way of understanding the significance of. Do you know if she lived alone the entire time you cleaned for her? No one else ever there. Always alone as far as I ever saw, Patricia said. Although, she paused, frowning slightly, as if reaching for a memory that had not occurred to her in years. There was a period a long time ago now, maybe 6 or 7 years back, where she asked me to skip a few cleanings. Said she was having some work done on the house and didn't want me dealing with the mess. I didn't think much of it at the time. It was just a few months, maybe 4 or 5, before she had me start coming back. Do you remember exactly when that was? Patricia thought hard, her face working through the effort of placing a memory in time. It would have been right around when she stopped at the daycare, now that you mention it. I remember because I asked her about it when I came back, asked how the retirement was treating her, and she seemed almost startled by the question, like she'd forgotten I knew about the daycare job at all. I gave Daniel this information and asked him to find everything he could about Carol Brennan's employment history, particularly anything connecting her to daycare facilities 7 years ago. and anything that might explain the gap in Patricia's cleaning schedule that aligned so precisely with the timing of Maya's disappearance. This part of the investigation moved faster, because employment records, even for small daycare facilities, tend to leave more accessible trails than informal flea market transactions and the private memories of an elderly woman's cleaning schedule. Carol Brennan had worked at a daycare facility called Little Sprouts Early Learning Center for approximately 11 years before retiring. The facility was located not far from Brookfield Elementary, the school Maya had attended, though Maya herself had moved on to elementary school years before her disappearance and would not have had any current connection to a daycare facility. This was not, in itself, conclusive of anything. Many people in the area might have worked near Maya's eventual school, without any connection to her disappearance. But Daniel kept pulling threads, and one of them led somewhere significant. Little Sprouts Early Learning Center had, according to state licensing records, been investigated twice during the years Carol Brennan worked there for complaints related to unauthorized contact between staff members and children outside of normal program hours. Both investigations had been closed without formal action, the complaints deemed insufficient for further proceedings, but the records existed, documented, available to anyone who knew to look for them with the right legal authority and patient determination. One of the two complaints, filed 9 years before Maya's disappearance, named Carol Brennan specifically. A parent had alleged that Carol had developed what the complaint described as an inappropriate attachment to a child in her care, including unauthorized visits to the family's home and gifts given without parental knowledge or consent. The complaint had been closed because the parent ultimately declined to pursue it further, citing, according to the limited records available, a desire to simply remove their child from the facility and move forward without further conflict, a decision Daniel and I discussed at length, both of us understanding the particular exhaustion that drives a parent toward avoidance rather than confrontation when their child's immediate safety appears, at least for the moment, to no longer be at risk. I sat with this information for a long time before I called Daniel back. Is there any way to know if Carol Brennan had contact with Maya specifically? Before she disappeared. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Eleanor, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Okay. Did Maya ever attend Little Sprouts? Even briefly. Even years before she disappeared. I had to think about this. Maya had attended several different childcare arrangements in her early years, given the demands of building the company during those years, arrangements I am not proud of having needed but had needed nonetheless, arrangements that had blurred together somewhat in my memory across the busy years that followed them. I called my ex-husband David that evening, for the first real conversation we had had in over a year, and asked him directly. Yes, he said, after a long pause that told me he was searching the same difficult memories I was searching. When she was 3. For about 8 months before we moved her to the program closer to home. I remember now. Little Sprouts. There was a woman there Maya liked. She used to talk about her sometimes even after we left. A woman named Carol. The line was quiet for a long moment after he said this. David, I said. I need you to remember everything you can about that. Everything Maya said about her. Anything at all. Eleanor, he said, and I could hear something breaking slightly in his voice, the same controlled grief I had been managing for 7 years finally cracking through his own composure. What did you find? I want to be careful here about how I present this part of the story, because I think there is a difference between what the evidence suggested and what could be definitively proven, and that difference matters enormously when we are talking about a missing child and the people whose lives were affected by her disappearance. What the evidence suggested, when assembled together over the following weeks, was this. Carol Brennan had worked at a daycare Maya briefly attended when she was 3 years old. Maya had apparently formed enough of a bond with Carol that she remembered her by name even after leaving the program, mentioning her, according to David's fragmented but genuine memories, on several occasions in the months and even years after they had stopped attending Little Sprouts. Carol had been the subject of a complaint, years before Maya's disappearance, alleging an inappropriate attachment to a different child in her care, including unauthorized contact outside the facility, a pattern that, according to a child psychologist Daniel and I consulted to help us understand what we were looking at, was consistent with what professionals in that field sometimes refer to as a fixation, a deeply unhealthy and potentially dangerous attachment that can develop in individuals who, for complex psychological reasons often rooted in their own unresolved losses, become unable to maintain appropriate boundaries with children in their care. Carol Brennan had, at some point in her life that nobody could precisely date with certainty, acquired children's clothing and accessories including a bicycle and the specific watch that had been on Maya's wrist the day she disappeared. Patricia's memory of a several-month gap in her cleaning schedule, occurring at almost exactly the time of Maya's disappearance and Carol's departure from the daycare, suggested a period during which Carol had not wanted anyone, even a trusted longtime cleaner, observing the inside of her home. What none of this proved, conclusively, definitively, was that Carol Brennan had taken Maya, or had any direct involvement in her disappearance on October 7th. The connections were significant, the pattern was deeply troubling, but a chain of suggestive evidence, however compelling, is not the same as proof, and I had spent enough years around legal processes through my business to understand that distinction with painful clarity. I need you to understand something about sitting with information like this. There is a particular kind of suffering in having a thread that suggests so much and proves so little. I could not simply accuse a dead woman of taking my daughter based on a watch and a complaint filed years earlier about a different child entirely, however much the pieces seem to fit together when I lay awake at night arranging and rearranging them. But I also could not, in good conscience, set this thread down without pursuing it as far as it could go. I went to the police with everything Daniel and I had assembled, presenting it in the most careful, methodical, evidence-based way I could manage, understanding that hysterical conviction, however justified it might feel internally, would not move an institutional process forward as effectively as patient, organized documentation. The original detective who had worked Maya's case 7 years earlier had since retired, but the department reopened an active inquiry based on the new information, assigning it to a detective named Maria Cortez, a careful and thorough woman who treated Carol Brennan as a person of significant interest in a case that had been cold for years, with a professionalism and seriousness that I had not necessarily expected after 7 years of the case occupying a steadily shrinking portion of institutional attention. What followed was months of careful, methodical work that I will not detail exhaustively here, because the specific investigative steps belong more properly to the people who conducted them than to this telling. What I will tell you is the outcome because the outcome is what ultimately matters to this story. Investigators obtained a warrant to search Carol Brennan's former property more thoroughly than her nephew's initial estate clearing had involved. They examined records from the daycare facility more closely, interviewed former colleagues who remembered Carol from her years there, several of whom, once approached with specific questions rather than general inquiries, recalled small, troubling details they had never thought significant enough to report at the time, the kind of details that take on new weight only in retrospect, once a larger pattern becomes visible. One former colleague, a woman who had worked alongside Carol for nearly 6 years, remembered her describing, on more than one occasion, a particular fondness for the quiet ones, children who seemed undersupervised or emotionally distant from their parents, children Carol seemed to feel a particular protective pull toward. This colleague had not thought much of these comments at the time, understanding them as the kind of warm, slightly over-involved sentiment that dedicated childcare workers sometimes express. In retrospect, examined alongside everything else, the comments took on a considerably more troubling significance. Investigators also pursued financial records that might reveal patterns inconsistent with a woman living alone on a modest income, the kind of patient financial archaeology that takes weeks, even with full institutional resources behind it. What they found eventually was a property record. A small cabin, registered decades earlier under a maiden name Carol had used before a brief marriage early in her life, located in a rural county nearly 3 hours from where she had lived for most of her adult years. The property had never been transferred or sold. Property taxes had been paid on it consistently, in small amounts for decades, through an account that traced back to Carol Brennan despite the different name on the deed, a connection that took considerable forensic financial work to establish definitively. Nobody had thought to look for property under a name Carol had not used in over 30 years. It was, Detective Cortez told me later, exactly the kind of detail that gets missed in initial investigations precisely because it requires looking for something specific that nobody yet knows to look for. I do not know, even now, fully and completely, what investigators found when they searched that cabin, because some details of an ongoing investigation involving a deceased individual and the circumstances surrounding a missing child case are not mine to share publicly, out of respect for the careful and ongoing nature of the work involved, and out of respect for processes that remain legally and procedurally sensitive even now. What I can tell you is this. Investigators found evidence at that cabin property consistent with a child having lived there for an extended period years prior, including personal items, drawings, and other materials that, when examined by specialists familiar with the original case, were assessed as likely belonging to a child matching Maya's age and circumstances during a period beginning shortly after her disappearance. What I can also tell you is that the property had been unoccupied for at least the past 3 to 4 years, according to the assessment of investigators examining accumulated dust, mail, and other indicators of habitation timeline, a finding that I will be honest with you produced a grief in me unlike anything I had experienced even in the original days and weeks after Maya disappeared, because it introduced a new and devastating question into a search that had, until that point, contained only the single overwhelming question of where. I am not going to tell you in this story the most painful details of what that timeline likely means, because some things belong to a grieving mother's private processing rather than to a public account, and because the full resolution of what actually happened during those years remains, even now, something investigators continue to work to understand completely with the careful, patient thoroughness that this kind of case requires and deserves. What I can tell you is that I finally know, after 7 years, considerably more than I knew before a small girl at a traffic intersection told me 6 words about a watch her mother said was hers. I know that my daughter likely lived, for some period of years after her disappearance, in a cabin 3 hours from where she vanished, in the care of a woman who had once worked at a daycare she briefly attended as a toddler, a woman whose own unresolved psychological wounds, whatever their origin, had calcified into something that took my daughter away from everyone who genuinely loved her. I know that period of her life, whatever it contained, appears to have ended sometime in the past 3 to 4 years, based on the evidence investigators have assessed, ended in a way that the property's abandonment suggests without yet confirming. I do not yet know, with the certainty I am still searching for, exactly what happened after that. The investigation continues. I have made peace, as much peace as a parent in my position can make, with the reality that some answers arrive slowly, in pieces over months and sometimes years, and that the watch on a beggar girl's wrist at a traffic intersection was never going to be the complete answer. It was the beginning of an answer. And after 7 years of nothing, a beginning was more than I had dared to hope for. I want to tell you about what happened with Renee and Sophie, because their part in this story matters enormously to me, separate from everything related to Maya and Carol Brennan and the ongoing investigation. Renee Calloway had been living with her daughter Sophie, in genuinely difficult circumstances for almost 2 years before I encountered them at that intersection. I have already told you about her job loss, her illness, the medical debt and housing instability that followed. I want to tell you now about what happened in the months after our first encounter, because I think it matters, and because I do not want this story to leave Renee and Sophie behind as merely instrumental to my own search. I want to be careful here about how I describe what I did next, because I do not want this to read as a wealthy woman performing generosity as a kind of redemption arc for herself, a narrative I have seen play out in other contexts in ways that ultimately center the wealthy benefactor's feelings rather than the genuine needs and dignity of the people being helped. That is not what this was, and it is not how I want it understood. What I want you to understand is this. Renee helped me when she had absolutely no obligation to do so. She could have walked away from a strange woman kneeling in front of her child at a traffic light. Instead, she gave me information. She connected me with the path that led to Patricia Holloway, and then to Carol Brennan, and then to a cabin 3 hours away that may finally help answer 7 years of unbearable not knowing. I did not help Renee and Sophie as a transaction in exchange for that assistance, though I understand why someone hearing this story might initially interpret it that way. I helped them because once I understood their circumstances, I could not, with any integrity, walk away from 2 people who had shown me genuine kindness while living through genuine hardship, kindness that cost Renee something real to extend, given everything she was already carrying. I covered Renee's outstanding medical debt, working with her directly rather than simply writing a check without her input, because I wanted her to have agency in how this assistance unfolded rather than having it imposed on her in a way that might have felt, however well-intentioned, like another form of disempowerment. I helped her secure stable housing, again working through the process with her rather than around her. I connected her, through contacts within my company, with employment that matched skills she had developed over years working in administrative roles before her illness disrupted everything, a position that began at a salary that reflected her actual capabilities, rather than the depleted resume that years of hardship had left her holding. Sophie is in school now, consistently, for the first time in nearly 2 years. She still has the watch. I told Renee, clearly and without any ambiguity, that the watch belongs to Sophie now, regardless of where it originated. Whatever its history, whatever painful chain of custody brought it from my daughter's wrist to a flea market table to Sophie's wrist, the watch is Sophie's. I would not take it from her, and I told her so directly, in terms an 8-year-old could understand, sitting with her in the same coffee shop booth where I had first heard Renee's story. It found its way to you, I told her. Some things are meant to be found by the people who need them. I do not know if that is precisely true in any cosmic sense. I am not, by inclination or practice, a particularly spiritual person, and I am wary of imposing tidy meaning onto circumstances that contain genuine, irreducible tragedy. But I believe it in the sense that matters to me. That watch led me to information I had been missing for 7 years. It would feel like a profound betrayal of whatever brought us together to take it from the child who had been wearing it with genuine, uncomplicated joy. Renee and I talk regularly now. Not as a formal arrangement, but because something real formed between us in those weeks of working together toward an answer that, in the end, mattered enormously to me and cost her considerable emotional energy to help pursue. She told me, eventually, what she had meant by her comment in that first coffee shop conversation about knowing what it was like not to know where someone was. Her own younger brother had disappeared when she was 19, run away from a difficult home situation, and had never been found. She had spent years in her own way, carrying an unresolved absence not entirely unlike my own, though she was careful, with a generosity I found remarkable given her own losses, never to suggest the two situations were equivalent. I just understood a little what it does to a person, she told me. The not knowing. I couldn't watch you carry that and not try to help, even if I didn't fully understand at first why it mattered so much. I want to be honest with you about where things stand right now, because I think a story like this one deserves an honest ending rather than a falsely tidy one. The investigation into Maya's case is ongoing. Investigators continue working to understand the complete timeline of what happened during the years between her disappearance and whatever circumstances led to the cabin being abandoned 3 to 4 years ago. I do not have all the answers I am searching for. I may never have all of them. What I have that I did not have 7 years of mornings ago is more than I had before. I have a place. I have a name connected to that place. I have evidence that allows investigators to pursue specific, concrete lines of inquiry rather than working from nothing, the way they had been working for years before that Thursday morning. I have learned to hold two things simultaneously that I previously believed were impossible to hold together. I have learned to grieve more fully, with more specific and devastating clarity, the years of my daughter's life that I was not present for. Years I now understand involved circumstances I cannot fully process even now. And I have learned at the same time to hold a kind of grim gratitude for finally having information after 7 years of absence, gratitude that exists alongside grief rather than replacing it, the two feelings occupying the same space in a way I would not have believed possible before living through it. I still drive past that intersection every morning. I do not look away anymore. I have come to understand, in a way I did not understand for 7 years, that looking away from the people who exist at the margins of every busy street in every city is a kind of luxury that costs more than I had ever calculated, a luxury I am no longer willing to afford myself. I think about Carol Brennan more than I expected to. I think about whatever loneliness or grief or unprocessed longing led a woman to do whatever she did, to whatever extent the investigation eventually clarifies, to a child who was not hers. I do not forgive what she did. I am not certain forgiveness is even the relevant framework for what I feel. But I think about her, and I think about the complaint filed 9 years before Maya disappeared, about a different child, a complaint that was closed without action because a frightened parent simply wanted to move forward without further conflict. I think about how many threads like that exist quietly, in systems that are designed to process complaints rather than to truly investigate patterns. I think about what might have been different if that earlier complaint had been pursued more thoroughly, though I understand, with the same clear-eyed pragmatism that has guided my professional life, that this kind of retrospective thinking, however natural, rarely produces anything except additional pain without corresponding insight. I have been talking for a long time, and I want to land somewhere honest before I let you go. This story began with the watch on a stranger's wrist at a traffic intersection. It is, in some ways, a story about the particular cruelty and the particular mercy of small, improbable coincidences. The watch could have ended up anywhere. It could have been melted down, discarded, lost entirely to the specific kind of erasure that happens to small objects moving through complicated, anonymous chains of secondhand transactions. Instead, it ended up on the wrist of a little girl at an intersection I happened to be stopped at on a Thursday morning, after 7 years of driving past that same intersection without stopping. I do not know what to make philosophically of coincidences like that one. I am not a particularly spiritual person, by inclination or by practice. But I find myself unable to dismiss the specific improbability of that morning as pure randomness, even though I recognize that calling it something more than randomness does not change anything about what actually happened to my daughter during the years I was searching for her. What I want you to take from this story, if you take anything at all, is this. Pay attention to the small details that catch your eye for reasons you cannot immediately explain. The flash of recognition that arrives before conscious thought has finished forming. I had spent 7 years training myself not to look too closely at the people I passed every day, because looking too closely had become unbearable. That training nearly cost me the one thread that connected back to my daughter after 7 years of nothing. I am not telling you that every small detail that catches your attention will lead somewhere significant. Most of them will not. That is simply the nature of attention and coincidence in an enormous and largely random world. But some of them will. And you will never know which ones matter unless you allow yourself to look closely enough to find out. I also want to say something about Renee, because I think it matters as much as anything else in this story. The people we pass every day at intersections, outside grocery stores, in the margins of our daily routines, carry entire histories of loss and resilience that we rarely take the time to see. Renee's kindness toward me, a complete stranger making an alarming, urgent approach toward her daughter, came from a place of genuine generosity despite circumstances that would have justified considerable wariness and self-protection instead. I think about that generosity often. I think it deserves to be remembered as its own form of heroism in this story, separate from anything it eventually led to. Okay, we have been here a while, and I am genuinely grateful you stayed for all of it. My name is Eleanor Whitfield. The investigation into what happened to my daughter during the years she may have spent at that cabin continues. I do not have a complete ending to offer you, because I do not have a complete ending yet myself. What I have is more than I had before. A thread. A direction. Information assembled patiently over months by people who took 7-year-old grief seriously enough to follow it wherever it led. Renee and Sophie are doing well. Sophie started a new school this fall. She still wears the watch most days, though she has started, Renee tells me, to also wear a different bracelet some days, something new and entirely her own, which feels like exactly the right kind of progress for an 8-year-old building her own relationship with the objects that matter to her. I think about butterflies sometimes, and about the question Maya asked me once, about whether they remember being caterpillars, whether some part of them holds on to what they used to be even after they transform into something completely different. I do not have a good answer for that question even now, 7 years later. But I think more than I used to that the answer might be yes. That transformation does not erase what came before it. Even when the form changes completely, even when years pass, even when the path from one state to another runs through circumstances nobody could have predicted or prevented. If this story reached you, drop a comment. Tell me what stayed with you. If you have ever looked away from something at the edge of your daily path that you wish now you had looked at more closely, I want to hear about it. I read everything. Subscribe if you are new here. New story every single day. Take care of yourselves. And look up sometimes, even at the red lights you have stopped at hundreds of times before. You never know what you might finally see. I will see you in the next one.